Welcome to Knit Pickers PEI in beautiful downtown Mayfield. Just yesterday I was hosting a Learn to Loom Knit workshop, and some of the participants asked if I had a YouTube video on how to cast off after finishing a project on a knitting loom. Now, of course, we go through that in the workshop, but there's a few steps involved. So they gave me a great idea for today's video, and shall we get to it? Now you can knit just about anything on a knitting loom. You can do knit stitches, purl stitches, you can knit in the round, you can knit stockinette, you can do cables, but there are two styles of stitches. One is called a double bed stitch, where to make the stitch you're going back and forth between one bed and another. So in this particular one I was doing our zigzag stitch, which is the double knit stitch, and it is a double bed stitch because we're crossing back and forth. If you're doing a single bed stitch, that could be knitting in the round, it could be stockinette. You might only be using a single bed here, or you might be using both beds, but you're not crossing back and forth. So say for instance I was knitting in the round. I'm using all the pegs, but it is still considered a single bed stitch because I'm not crossing back and forth between the two beds. And this is important because when you're casting off, if you are doing a double bed stitch, a stitch that crosses back and forth between the two beds, you have to join your sides together before you actually start the cast off. So I'm going to go through the whole thing here, and that way you'll know whether or not you're doing a single bed stitch or a double bed stitch. You'll still be able to do the cast off process. So to start, if you're working a double bed, you want your yarn, when the loom is facing you, to be on your left hand side. It doesn't matter if it's coming from the top peg or from the bottom peg, as long as your yarn is on the left hand side. And what I'm going to do then is I'm going to transfer the stitches from the bottom to the top. Now on our novice loom I just tend to use my fingers. I find it easier than using the little tool that comes with it. But that's totally up to you. If you have a tool that you prefer to use, if you use one of our ergonomic loom hooks, or if you use a crochet hook, or the little wooden tool that comes with the kit, any of those options are perfectly fine. But when I'm using a chunky wool like this, I find it just as easy to use my fingers. So I'm just about finished transferring all the stitches from one side to the other. And a little trick that I do, I take my knitting right here and I tuck it underneath the loom. What that does is it helps these stitches from popping back up and off. So here you go, I've now got 2 stitches on every peg on the top bed and no stitches left on the bottom peg. So now I want to join my 2 sides together. So to do that, I'm going to wrap the pegs in a counterclockwise motion. Counterclockwise, imagine doing writing the cursive letter E, a lowercase e, or just wrap the peg from the right side to the left. So right side and around, right side and around, right side and around, all the way to the end. And just make sure that your stitches don't pop off. There we go, and I'm just going to wrap it around the end peg to hold it in place. So now I've got 3 stitches on every peg. Whoops, now you see this one did pop off, so I'm just going to wrap that again. There we go. So now I'm going to bring the 2 bottom stitches up and over. You can do that singly, just like that, or you can grab both bottom stitches at the same time, And a lot is going to depend on the type of yarn you're working with. This is a 4-ply wool, nice and stretchy. It's a chunky wool, so it's easy to grab. And you want to make sure you don't do what I just did, which is pull them all up and over. There we go. So now my two sides are joined together, and now I'm ready to cast off. So if you had a single bed stitch, even if it wrapped all the way around the loom, that's fine. This is now going to be our cast off section. So what you do is you take your yarn and you just pop it over from right to left over the peg. Pick up this stitch, knit that stitch, and take the stitch that you just knit and move it over to the neighboring peg. Now you could continue to do exactly that. You could take your yarn, go over the peg from right to left, bring your two stitches up and over, just like this, and pick this stitch up and move it over to the neighboring peg. But what can happen sometimes is as you're casting off, you're using fewer and fewer and fewer of your pegs. And the loom, when you're knitting, is holding your tension for you. It keeps everything nice and consistent, nice and even. But as you're casting off, the loom isn't holding your stitches as much anymore because you're using fewer and fewer pegs. And what can happen is your beginning knitting can be this width, and as you cast off, it can pull in and become a little narrower. So there's a little trick that helps with that. And you're just using the benefit of working with the loom in your knitting. So what you do, instead of just wrapping the peg you want to knit, you make a big loop. You go around the empty peg you want to knit, or the empty peg that you just knit, and the peg that you are knitting now. So you're still making that one big loop, but you're going first around the neighboring empty peg and the peg you want to knit. Bring these two stitches up and over. This here, that is just your stretch stitch. That's just giving your cast off edge a little bit of extra ease. So we can drop that off, and then we pick this stitch up, and over to the neighbor she goes. And once again, around the empty peg and the peg you want to knit, bring your two stitches up and over, drop your stretch stitch, new stitch over to the neighbor. And again, around, starting always with the empty peg and the peg you want to knit, two stitches up and over, there's your stretch, and drop that off, pick up your stitch, and over to the neighbor she goes. And you continue working that way until you reach the end of the row. So I'll take it all the way down to the end of the row and I'll join you back in a couple of seconds. So here I am, just down to almost the very last stitch. So here's my stretch stitch. I'm just going to drop that off, pick up this stitch, and move it over to the final peg. Take my yarn from right to left, around the empty peg and the peg I want to knit. Bring my two stitches up and over, just like that. Here's my stretch stitch, drop that off, and here's my final stitch. So what I would do is I'd take this off my loom, I would snip my yarn, feed that yarn through the loop, snug it up tight, and then weave my end in. And you can see that your cast off edge and your cast on edge are nice and even. Now what I did, I saved this little sample piece of knitting from when I first started to loom knit. This is a stockinette piece of knitting. Knit a row, purl a row. Now here's my cast on edge. And here is my cast off edge. And you can see how much I pulled in doing the cast off. And that's because I didn't do that little trick of giving myself a little bit of extra ease by wrapping the adjacent empty peg and the peg I want to knit. So this is quite a firm cast off, but your cast on has a little bit of stretch. So by taking just that little bit of extra time and wrapping your empty peg and the peg you want to knit, and then dropping your stretch stitch off and carrying on down the row, that is going to take care of this little problem of not having your two ends be the same width. The stretch stitch cast off technique can be used on any loom. It doesn't have to be a little wooden novice loom like we have here. It can be a circular loom. It can be a loom with much finer pegs. It doesn't matter the style of loom that you're working with. It's just the technique. And the technique of giving yourself a little bit of extra ease as you cast off will ensure that your cast on and your cast off edges are nice and even. So for those of you who've attended our Learn to Loom Knit workshop, I hope this little refresher helps you when you're finishing off a project. If you haven't done any loom knitting before, you're welcome to come and learn a little bit about loom knitting at one of our workshops. They're offered every Wednesday and Friday morning through to Thanksgiving, and then we start again up in May. I also have the loom knitting kits. Our knitting looms are made right here in Prince Edward Island, and they come with a set of instructions, as well as I've written a pattern book that goes through a number of the different stitches as well. So if you have any questions, I hope you'll touch base with me, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.